The high desert came at Calhoun Briggs the way it always did in late October, flat and merciless, the morning sun cutting sideways out of the southeast and turning the scrub brush into copper wire. He was 53 years old and built like something the land had left behind after the softer material eroded away. His beard had gone the color of old pewter at the jaw and fire iron black everywhere else, and the backs of his hands carried the particular landscape of a man who had worked them against metal and pavement and rope for 3 unbroken decades. He sat astride his bike at the edge of the pull-off outside Kinsey, Arizona, engine idling, watching the elementary school bus release its cargo onto the gravel loop 140 yards north. He did not intend to watch it. He had stopped because the rear tire felt soft, and he was checking pressure with the pump clipped to his left saddlebag. But then his eyes found the girl. She was walking at the end of the line, the way a child walks when she has learned it is safer at the back, and she was doing something with her right arm that he could not immediately explain. She lifted the arm, pressed the elbow hard against her ribs, and kept it there. Then she adjusted the sleeve of her jacket with her left hand, tucking something up into the cuff. Then she did it again, 10 feet further on. She was 8 years old, maybe, small even for 8. The jacket was a man's denim cut down badly, the hem riding at her thighs, both cuffs folded back 3 times. She walked into the school without looking at anyone. He watched the door close behind her. The pump was still in his hand. He had not checked the tire. 41 days later, 450 members of the Ash Creek Riders came down out of the hills north of Kinsey in a column that took 11 minutes to pass any given point on the road. The sound arrived 3 minutes before the bikes did, rolling ahead like weather, and every business on the main block of Kinsey sent someone outside to look. A woman at the county social services office on Cedar Street stood at her second-floor window and watched the column turn and watched it stop, and she held her coffee cup without drinking from it for a long time. What she felt was something she would describe later as being sure she had the wrong understanding of everything. No one who saw it expected what they saw. That is the part nobody was ready for. The morning it began, properly began, the October light was already hard and yellow-white at 6:45 when Calhoun Briggs rolled the bike out of the bay behind his house on the west edge of Kinsey and began the ride north on Route 89 toward the Ash Creek Chapter House, 14 miles up the highway. He had been president of the Ash Creek Riders for 11 years. He was the last of the 4 founders still riding, the other 3 having arrived at their separate exits by separate roads. And the weight of that fact had settled into him the way altitude settles into a man who lives at 4,000 feet. He no longer noticed it consciously, but it was present in every breath. The Ash Creek Riders numbered 68 members in the Kinsey chapter, with chapters in Flagstaff and Sedona that brought the regional count to 214. They rode big, loud machines. They wore black leather and the club cut. People who did not know them crossed the street. This was not without reason. This was also not the whole story. Calhoun himself stood 6'2" and weighed 230 pounds, and his face was not a face that invited casual conversation. The scar that ran from his left cheekbone to the corner of his jaw had come from a piece of sheared metal on a construction site 18 years ago, not from anything dramatic, but it read dramatic regardless. He did not correct this. He pulled into the chapter house lot at 7:08, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a long ride, that silence that is not quiet but is rest. His sergeant-at-arms, a rangy 40-year-old named Polk Deaver, was already out front leaning against the rail with 2 cups of coffee. Polk had a nickname that was not appropriate for daylight and a set of mechanic's hands that could take apart a carburetor in less time than most men could find the right wrench. He handed Calhoun the coffee without being asked and said nothing until Calhoun had taken 3 sips. "You're 2 minutes late," Polk said. Rear tire was soft. Again? Again. This was their language. a language built across 11 years of riding the same roads in all weathers, and it required very few words to carry a great deal. Calhoun drank his coffee and thought about the girl at the bus loop, the way she had pressed that elbow to her ribs. He had not stopped thinking about it, not really, not since the day before. He had an instinct, shaped by years he did not talk about, and a loss that lived at the center of him like a stone in deep water, and the instinct was telling him that what the girl had tucked into her sleeve was food, that she was hiding it. That she was hiding it because she was afraid it would be taken. He did not say this to Polk. He drank the coffee and looked at the highway and let the morning arrange itself around him, and then he said, "I need to go back through Kinsey this afternoon." Polk looked at him. "Okay, swing by the elementary school on Cotter Road." Polk did not ask why. That was also part of the language. They rode back through Kinsey at 3:30, when the school day was ending. Calhoun parked the bike on the shoulder of Cotter Road and watched the dismissal the way he watched most things, from a distance and without moving, his arms folded and his eyes doing the work. The children came out in the usual disorder of an elementary school afternoon, noise and backpacks and the small chaos of 100 kids recombining with parents and buses. He found her almost immediately. She was in the same jacket. She was doing the same thing. This time he saw it clearly. She had a piece of bread, white bread, a single slice, folded twice to fit inside the cuff, and she pressed it against herself with the arm and kept walking, eyes forward, not looking at anyone. He watched her cross to the far side of the parking lot, where a woman stood by an old Civic. The woman was maybe 30, thin in the way that is not chosen, wearing scrubs that had been through too many wash cycles. She put her hand on the girl's shoulder when she reached her, and the girl looked up at her, and neither of them smiled. They got in the car. Calhoun sat on the bike and did not start it for a while. A teacher who had been supervising dismissal was walking back toward the school, and he raised a hand and she stopped. She was maybe 35, mid-length hair, the particular careful expression of a school professional who has just noticed a large man with a club cut watching her students. He understood the expression. He did not move quickly or stand up from the bike. He said, "Excuse me, I'm not trying to be strange. I was through here yesterday morning, and I saw a little girl at the bus loop doing something with her sleeve. I thought she might be hiding food. Does that make sense to you?" The teacher was quiet for a moment. She had the look of someone choosing between two versions of an answer. She said, "Are you a parent?" "No." "Are you with the school?" "No." He said it flat and did not explain further. She looked at him, and then at the club name on the leather cut, and then back at him. "Why do you want to know?" He thought about the true answer and decided it was the one to give. "Because I'm from here, and because somebody ought to be asking." She was quiet again for longer. Then she said, "I've already filed. The family is known to the county." "Filed what?" "A concern report." He held the word concern in his mind, felt the distance between that word and the bread hidden in a small cuff, and kept his voice even. "How long ago?" She looked at him for 3 more seconds and said, "Come back tomorrow morning," and walked back into the school without turning around. He came back the next morning. Her name was Vonda Presco, and she had been the 3rd grade teacher at Kinsey Elementary for 9 years, and she met him at the side entrance at 7:15, with the door propped open and 2 chairs pulled up in the hallway just inside. She did not invite him deeper into the building. He did not expect her to. She told him what she knew, which was precise and small and devastating in the way that precise small things can be. The girl's name was Marcy Falk. She was 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. She had been a 2nd grader when Vonda first noticed the sleeve behavior, meaning it had been going on for at least 1.5 years. The food was always different. A piece of bread, half a cracker, a single orange segment. Always small, always hidden against the body. The county concern report which carried the official classification of a welfare flag under the Arizona Department of Child Safety Protocols, had been filed 6 weeks prior. Vonda had called to follow up twice. She had been told the case was in the queue. She said the word queue the way a person says a word they want to set on fire. Calhoun listened. He did not shift in the chair. He asked one question. "What's the queue look like for a welfare flag?" She looked at him. 12 to 16 weeks. "What happens to Marcy in 12 to 16 weeks?" She did not answer, which was its own answer. He stood up, shook her hand, thanked her, and walked back out to the bike. He sat on it in the morning cold with the engine off for 4 minutes and 10 seconds, not that he counted, and then he called Polk Deaver. "Chapter House," he said. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. Full table." Polk said, "What kind of meeting?" Calhoun said, "The kind where we do something." He started the bike and let the engine run for a moment, feeling the vibration come up through the frame and into his hands, and he looked at the school building in the flat autumn light and thought about a word he did not use often, queue. The idea that a child could be assigned to a queue. He rode north toward the chapter house, and the day opened up around him, hard and blue and wide, the way the high desert opened every morning as if it were the first one. The chapter house had a main room that sat comfortably at 60 and uncomfortably at more than that, and that night it held 68. Word had gone through the phone chain in the afternoon and people had come. Calhoun stood at the front and told them what he knew, which took 4 minutes. He did not editorialize and he did not perform outrage. He stated facts: the girl's name, her age, the sleeve, the bread, the concern report, the queue. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment that had weight to it, the kind of quiet that is not absence but compression. Polk Deaver spoke first. He said, "What do we know about the mother?" Calhoun said he did not yet know much. He knew the woman drove an older Civic, wore medical scrubs, and had the look of someone carrying too many things with not enough hands. He had not yet spoken to her. A member named Richie Souls, 47, who had been a licensed social worker for 6 years before the road found him, said, "If the family is already flagged, we can't just knock on their door and start handling things. We go in wrong. We spook the situation and make it harder for the county to act." There were nods. Calhoun said, "What do we do right?" Richie said, "We find out what the actual condition is first. We make contact through a channel the mother won't feel threatened by. And we find out who's holding the welfare case and why 12 to 16 weeks is acceptable for an 8-year-old going hungry." A man near the back who went by the name Dutch, 61, a retired postal route driver with a jaw like a load-bearing wall, said, "I know the woman at the food bank on Maple. I've done the Thanksgiving run for them for 7 years. I can ask what they know without making anything official." There was more quiet. And then Calhoun said, "Here's what we do tonight." He laid it out in the practical, unsentimental language of a man who had run organized operations for a long time. Dutch to the food bank, Richie to pull the county DCS public information on processing timelines. 2 members named Cosgrove and Tate to do a quiet survey of what food resources existed within 2 miles of the school. And Calhoun himself to go back to Vonda Presco in the morning for the one piece of information he had not thought to ask the day before. What did Marcy Falk's home address look like from the outside? He told them not to approach the house, not to approach the mother, and not to approach the girl. He told them they were going to understand the situation before they moved in it. There was not a single argument. That, too, was part of the language. The next 3 weeks had a texture to them that Calhoun recognized from other work, from the construction sites of his 20s and the road operations of his 30s. The texture of a thing being built in sequence, each piece necessary and none of them sufficient alone. Dutch came back from the food bank with the information that a woman matching the description of Marcy's mother had applied for assistance 4 months ago, been placed on a waiting list for the county supplement program, and had not yet received her first delivery. The waiting list, Calhoun was told, was 11 weeks at current intake levels. Richie Soules spent 2 evenings on the phone navigating the Arizona Department of Child Safety's public-facing information lines and arrived at the chapter house on the 3rd night with the expression of a man who has walked through a building and found it smaller inside than the sign suggested. The processing queue for a standard welfare flag in their county was running at 14 weeks. The case had been assigned to a caseworker named Elspeth Marin at the Kingman Field Office, which was 63 miles from Kinsey. Richie had her direct line. He had not yet called it. He was waiting for instruction. Cosgrove and Tate had driven the streets around the school and identified 3 food access points: a convenience store a quarter-mile east, a church pantry on Pima Street open Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the elementary school cafeteria, which offered a free breakfast program that Marcy Falk was not enrolled in. Not enrolled. Calhoun sat with that for a long moment when Cosgrove said it. He asked why. Cosgrove said, "Enrollment requires a parent to come in and fill out the income verification form. School says they sent the form home twice." Calhoun said, "And they don't know if the mother received them." He thought about the woman in the scrubs, the way she had moved to the car without smiling. He thought about a person holding too much. He thought about the forms, the 14 weeks, the 11-week waiting list, the 63 miles between Kinsey and the caseworker. He thought about Marcy Falk pressing a folded piece of bread against her ribs with one small arm. Then he told the room what he had learned from Vonda Presco on the 2nd morning. He had asked the teacher what the exterior of the Falk address looked like, and Vonda had not been sure, so she had driven past it after school the previous Friday. She had described a single-wide mobile home on the south end of the Mesa Park development, a broken porch light, a car in the drive, and a front window with the interior curtain pinned from inside so that it did not move when the door opened. She had said, "It's not a house that knows anyone is watching over it," and Calhoun had carried that sentence with him for 9 days. Now he said it to the room. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Dutch said, "So we fixed the porch light." Calhoun almost smiled. He did not quite. Caseworker Elspeth Marin was a 26-year DCS veteran who answered her direct line on the 2nd ring and spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had learned, through long experience, that the first 3 minutes of any conversation determined whether it would be productive. She told Richie Soules on the phone that she was familiar with the Falk case and that it was in process, and that she was not in a position to discuss case details with a private citizen. Richie said, with the particular courtesy of a man who had spent 6 years as a state-licensed professional and still carried the vocabulary, "I'm not asking for case details, Ms. Marin. I'm calling as a community member to note that there is a documented child in this county who is concealing food on her person during school hours and has been doing so for at least 18 months, and that the community is prepared to provide supplemental support to the family if the county is able to give us a referral pathway that doesn't create a problem for the open case." There was a pause. Elspeth Marin said, "What community?" Richie said, "The Ash Creek Riders. We're a motorcycle club based out of Kinsey." Another pause. Longer. She said, "I'll need to call you back." She called back in 4 hours. She had spoken to her supervisor. She had also, it turned out, spent some portion of those 4 hours looking up the Ash Creek Riders, because when she called back, her voice had a different quality, more careful in its precision, as if she were choosing each word from a larger set. She said the case could not be discussed in detail. She said that the family's participation in county food supplement programs was a separate administrative matter from the welfare assessment. She said that if a community organization wished to coordinate with the school regarding a child's nutritional access through the school's own free breakfast program, that was a conversation between the organization and the school and did not require county involvement. She said all of this in sequence, flatly, without inflection, the way a person reads out the instructions, that are hidden in the instructions. Richie thanked her and called Calhoun and repeated the conversation word for word. Calhoun said, "She told us exactly what to do." Richie said, "She did." Calhoun called Vonda Presco at 7 that evening. He told her the club wanted to come in and meet with the principal. He told her they wanted to talk about the breakfast enrollment form and about what it would take to get Marcy Falk and her mother the help that was sitting a signature away. He told her they were not going to make noise about it. He told her they were going to be quiet and useful. There was a silence on the line, and then Vonda Presco said something that he would hear in his head for years afterward. She said, "How many of you are there?" He said, "Enough." He had not meant for it to become what it became. He had meant for it to be 68 men and women moving quietly through a county system to extract one child from one specific gap between one program and another. That was the intent. But the Flagstaff chapter heard about it through their charter liaison, and the Sedona chapter heard through Polk Dever's counterpart there, and both chapters asked to be included, which brought the count to 214. And then a thing happened that Calhoun had not anticipated. The story got out. Not to the press, not to the public. It got out the way things get out in communities of people who ride. Through a phone call from one road captain to another. Through a message passed at a fuel stop. Through the particular grapevine of people who understand that a club is not only those who hold the cut. Riders from 2 other Arizona chapters, neither affiliated with the Ash Creek Riders, called Calhoun directly within 72 hours and asked if they could stand in support. He told them he would call them back. He sat with it for one night, understanding what it meant to say yes and what it meant to say no. He thought about the count. 214 was a number with weight. He thought about 450 and understood that the weight was different. He said yes. The meeting with Principal Horace Dillard and Vonda Presco was not what Dillard had expected. He was 60 years old and had run schools in rural Arizona for 22 years, and he was not a man easily surprised. But he sat across the table from Calhoun Briggs and Richie Soules and Vonda Presco and looked at the paperwork Richie had assembled, the documented processing timelines, the enrollment form gap, the food bank waiting list, and he was quiet for a while. He said, "The form requires an in-person verification because of federal income documentation requirements. I cannot waive that." Calhoun said, "We're not asking you to waive it. We're asking if someone from the school can go to the mother's home with the form and help her fill it out, and whether there is any reason the club cannot provide interim food support to the family starting this week under the school's community partnership guidelines." Dillard looked at the form Richie had pulled up on the tablet. Community partnership guidelines. Correct terminology. Correctly cited. He looked at Calhoun with a new expression and said, "You've done this kind of thing before." Calhoun said, "We do what needs doing." The principal reached for his pen. The morning Vonda Presco drove to the Mesa Park development with the income verification form. Calhoun rode behind her at a distance and parked 2 streets over and did not get out. This was not his moment. It belonged to Vonda and to the woman in the scrubs, whose name he now knew was Teresa Falk, 31, home health aide, working 43 hours a week at a rate that left a gap that should not have existed in a functioning system but did. The meeting took 22 minutes. Vonda came out and got in her car and drove to the end of the block, and Calhoun pulled alongside and she rolled her window down. She had been crying. Not dramatically, just the eyes. She said, "Teresa didn't know the form had been sent. The backpack has a torn lining. The forms went through the lining. The backpack, the torn lining." He thought about all the machinery that had failed around this single fact. He looked at the school building in the distance. He thought about Marcy pressing that fold of bread against herself each morning, saving it, keeping it, carrying it through the day the way you carry a thing you are not sure you will have again. He had done that himself, once. He had been 9 years old in a house that did not always have what a house should have, and he had saved food in his pockets, and he had never told anyone that, and the memory lived in him the way old injuries live, not as pain anymore but as weather sense, as the ability to read a certain sky. He looked at his own hands on the handlebars and thought, this is what that was for. Vonda said, she signed the form. Marcy is enrolled starting Monday, he said. Good. He meant it to be the whole sentence. There was more, though. 450 more. The Saturday they came, the sky over Kinsey was the particular deep blue of a high desert morning in the third week of November, the kind of blue that is cold and absolute and does not negotiate. Calhoun had been at the pull-off on Cotter Road since 6:45, alone, watching the light come. The column arrived at 7:15, and he heard it before he saw it, the way you hear a storm front before the sky changes, that low roll of organized sound coming out of the hills north of town. 450 members of various chapters and allied clubs, all in proper cuts, all on their own machines, strung out along the highway in a disciplined column that their road captains had organized the night before at the staging area 12 miles north. They came down the highway and turned onto the main road through Kinsey, and they did not rev or perform. They moved at a steady pace, measured, and they filled the road from the turn to the school parking lot and 3 blocks beyond, and the sound of 450 engines at idle was its own kind of silence, the silence of something very large, holding itself very still. People came out of their houses and stood on their porches. The woman at the county social services office on Cedar Street went to her second-floor window. A man at the gas station on the highway stood beside his pump with the nozzle in his hand and did not move it. The Ash Creek Riders had arranged, through Principal Dillard, to park in the school lot and the adjacent church lot and the gravel field behind the hardware store, and they did so in sequence, each bike going to its designated space. The organizational precision of it, something Calhoun had insisted upon, because he understood the importance of not looking like a problem when you were trying to be a solution. He stood at the front of the school entrance and watched them file off their machines. 450. He had been thinking about that number for 2 weeks. He had not thought about what it would look like as a physical fact, as 450 actual human beings parking their actual motorcycles in an actual town. It looked like the whole world having an opinion. Teresa Falk had been told. Vonda had told her the day before, carefully, specifically, making sure she understood that no one was coming to her house. No one was going to ask anything of her. No one was going to make a scene. The club had quietly, through Dutch and the food bank and the church pantry on Pima Street and 3 members who had made personal purchases at the big box store in Flagstaff, assembled 14 boxes of groceries and household supplies. They were sitting in Dutch's truck, stacked and organized, covered with a tarp, awaiting delivery through the food bank's volunteer program, so that the delivery would be official and unremarkable, and not in any way something that could embarrass Teresa Falk or reduce her. That was the instruction Calhoun had given, nothing that reduces her. Marcy Falk and her mother arrived at the school at 8:43. They came in the old Civic, and Marcy got out first and stood on the gravel and looked at the bikes. There were still riders visible in the parking lot, men and women standing by their machines, and she stood and looked at them with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a child for whom the world had not yet finished being strange. She was wearing the same denim jacket with the folded cuffs. She was not hiding anything in the sleeve. Teresa came around the car and put her hand on Marcy's shoulder, and Marcy pointed at the bikes and said something Calhoun could not hear from where he stood. Vonda was at the entrance, and she walked out to meet them, and she guided them inside, and as they passed through the door, Marcy turned and looked directly at Calhoun. He did not know if she knew who he was or what his presence meant. He raised one hand. She raised one hand back, the small hand coming up in a precise mirror of his, and then the door closed between them. Behind him, 450 people held very still. Inside the school gymnasium, Principal Dillard had arranged chairs in the configuration of a community meeting, and the riders filtered in over the next 30 minutes and filled the room and the hallway beyond it and stood along the walls. The gymnasium was meant for 200. It held more than that now by a significant margin, shoulder to shoulder. Big men and women in road gear standing with their hands at their sides and their voices low. Dillard stood at the front and looked at the room for a long moment before he said anything, and Calhoun, watching him from the side, saw the principal's jaw work once and then still, the way a man's jaw works when he is deciding what kind of speech this is. Dillard said, "I have been running schools in this county for 22 years. I have had community partners, I have had volunteers. I have never had anything like this." He paused. "I want to say that plainly." Richie Soules had made contact with Elspeth Marin a second time, and this time the conversation had been different. Marin had requested, through her supervisor, an expedited review of the Falk case on the grounds of, as she put it in the formal language of her request letter, substantial community documentation of ongoing welfare concern. Expedited review meant the 14-week queue became 2 weeks. It meant a caseworker visit the following Thursday. It meant the gap closed. The document Richie read aloud in that gymnasium was a letter from Elspeth Marin. She had not been asked to write it. She had written it herself and faxed it to the school that morning. It was 4 paragraphs. The third paragraph said, in full, "The presence of an organized community willing to document, advocate, and provide supplemental support within the guidelines of existing programs represents exactly the kind of oversight this office is not always able to provide, and I am grateful for it." She had used the word grateful in a formal DCS correspondence. Richie read it flat, the way the specification for reading such things required. No performance, just the words. And the gymnasium was so quiet that the ventilation system was the loudest thing in it. Calhoun was standing along the far wall, arms folded, watching the room. He watched Polk Deaver, who was not a man who showed anything in his face, put one hand over his mouth and look at the floor. He watched Dutch, who had worked the Thanksgiving food run for 7 years without anyone making a speech about it, shake his head slowly from side to side. Not in disagreement, but in the particular motion of a person receiving something they did not know they had been waiting to receive. He thought about his own mother, who had been 33 and very tired in a house in the high desert, and about the thing he had carried in his pocket, and about all the organizations and offices and programs that had had a queue for her. He did not cry. He came close enough to know the shape of it, close enough to feel it in the sternum, and then he breathed it back. Marcy Falk was not in the gymnasium. She was in her classroom on the 2nd floor, in the 3rd row, eating her free breakfast from the school cafeteria program, the enrollment form now processed, the gap now closed. She did not know about the room below her. She knew she had eaten, that morning, without hiding anything in her sleeve. That was enough, more than enough. From the gymnasium, Calhoun heard someone begin to clap, and then the clap multiplied the way things multiply when 450 people decide to feel the same thing at the same time, and the sound went up through the floor and the walls of the old building and out into the cold blue morning over Kinsey, and somewhere above it, a small girl ate her breakfast. 3 weeks after the gymnasium morning, the Ash Creek Riders voted to establish an annual food drive in partnership with the Kinsey Elementary Free Breakfast Program, budgeted at $6,000 per year, drawn from club event proceeds, with a named fund and a formal partnership agreement signed by Principal Dillard and countersigned by Calhoun Briggs. The fund was called the Open Sleeve Fund. That was Vonda Presco's name for it, suggested quietly to Polk Deaver, who brought it to the table without attribution, and the table voted for it without discussion, because some names are simply right. The Flagstaff and Sedona chapters committed matching annual contributions. The two allied clubs that had joined the column sent letters through their road captains confirming they would participate in the first annual event the following spring. The first event drew 312 participants and raised $11,400, almost double the original budget. At the first event, Richie Souls and Vonda Presco stood at a folding table near the registration tent, and riders came through and signed the partnership log, and Richie got a brief, correct phone call from Elspeth Marin, who told him the Falk case had been closed, which in DCS language meant resolved in the family's favor. Teresa Falk was enrolled in the county supplement program, the case was documented, and the follow-up visits were scheduled. Marin did not elaborate. She did not need to. By the spring of the following year, 2 framed photographs hung in the hallway outside the Kinsey Elementary main office. One showed the column coming down the main road in November, 450 bikes, the morning light catching the chrome and the road leather in the particular gold that November light makes in the high desert. The other showed a child's drawing, done in crayon, a figure on a large motorcycle with a beard that was 2 colors and a hand raised in greeting. The figure in the drawing was large and the bike was red, which was not accurate, and the sky above them was the yellow of a child who does not yet know that skies are sometimes not kind. Beneath the drawing, in a second grader's still-forming print, were 5 words. He waved at me first. Calhoun saw the drawing at the open house in April and stood in front of it for a long time, longer than he intended. He was 53 years old, and he had ridden this desert for 30 years, and he had been feared in every county in the northern part of the state, and he stood in a school hallway looking at a crayon drawing of himself and felt the specific weight of a stone lifting out of deep water. He did not tell anyone what he felt. He turned and walked back out to the parking lot, where 450 bikes had stood 4 months before, and he stood in the open space where the machines had been, and he looked at the sky, which was exactly as wide and blue and absolute as it had been on that November morning, the same sky, the same desert, the same light coming hard and clean from the southeast. What you look like is not what you are. The road teaches this, if you stay on it long enough. The roar of 450 engines had shaken the windows of this old building and frightened no one who needed to be frightened. And one small girl had eaten her breakfast in peace, and the sound of it, if you listened from the right direction, was the gentlest thing the high desert had ever heard.